There is a moment, one single, shattering moment, when a man destroys the only thing that ever truly saved him, and he does it with a smile on his face while the whole world watches. Damien Vescari stood before 500 of Chicago's most powerful and most dangerous people, held his wife's hand one last time, and handed her papers that ended everything. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked at him like she already knew the world was made of people who leave. What Damien didn't know, what no one knew, was that the woman he had just broken was already carrying his son. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me until the very last second, because nothing about this ends the way you think it will. The Mortimer estate sat on the northern edge of Lakeshore Drive like a monument to excess, its iron gates wide open on the night of December 19th, swallowing limousines 3 at a time. Black crystal chandeliers, imported from a Czech manufacturer who had since been quietly bought out and dissolved, hung in cascading tiers above the grand ballroom, throwing cold, fractured light across a crowd that represented everything wrong with American power. Politicians stood beside men who had ordered their opponents silenced. Hedge fund managers laughed with people whose business model was human fear. Everyone dressed beautifully. Everyone smiled with their teeth. Damien Vescari arrived at 9:47, 7 minutes late by design. He was 36 years old, 6 feet 2, and built like a man who had survived things that should have killed him, because he had. The charcoal suit he wore cost more than most people's cars, but it didn't make him look soft. Nothing made Damien look soft. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His eyes were a gray so pale they looked almost colorless in certain light, and the scar that curved below his left ear, thin, deliberate, the work of a blade rather than an accident, was the only thing he never tried to hide. It was the one true piece of autobiography visible on his body. Serena walked beside him. She wore midnight blue, a gown that skimmed her shoulders and pooled slightly at the floor, and she moved through the crowd the way she always moved, with a composure so complete it looked effortless, which meant no one ever understood how hard she worked to maintain it. She was 33. She had dark hair pinned low at the nape of her neck, warm brown skin that caught the chandelier light and held it, and a mouth that had learned over 5 years of marriage to Damien Vescari to say almost nothing in public. She had learned which smiles to perform. She had learned which rooms to disappear from before the conversations turned. She had learned, slowly and at great cost, that being Damien's wife meant existing in a constant state of beautiful, careful silence. What she had not learned, what she could not have known, was that tonight was the last night she would be his wife at all. Damien kept his hand at the small of her back as they moved through the room. His touch was light, controlled. Serena felt it as a kind of pressure that had nothing to do with affection, the pressure of a man performing a role with tremendous precision. She had felt that particular quality in his hands before, usually in the hours before something bad happened. "You're tense," she said quietly, her lips barely moving. "I'm always tense," he said. "You're more tense than usual." He didn't answer. 3 men intercepted them near the bar, Mafia council representatives, though no one in the room would have used that phrase out loud. Aldo Ferrante, 61, who ran the South Side with a combination of old-world etiquette and breathtaking cruelty. Marcus Benedetti, 54, whose import business was as legitimate as the council chose to make it on any given week. And Giancarlo Voss, 72, the oldest and most respected of the 3, whose opinion carried the kind of weight that ended careers and began graves. They greeted Damien the way powerful men greet each other, with warmth that was entirely theater. Serena stood beside her husband, smiled at the right moments, and noted that none of the 3 men looked at her tonight the way they usually did. Usually there was assessment in their eyes, the faint, constant evaluation of a woman attached to someone important, sizing up her usefulness, her control, her loyalty. Tonight there was something else, something that read as pity, almost. Or worse, relief. She filed it away. Damien moved through the evening like a chess player executing an endgame he had mapped out weeks in advance. He drank a single glass of scotch and didn't finish it. He shook exactly the right hands. He laughed at exactly the right moments. He kept Serena close but not intimate, close enough that abandoning her would read as sudden, which was, she would understand much later, entirely the point. At 11:15, the orchestra took a break. The crowd shifted. Waitstaff moved through with champagne. In the brief lull, Damien leaned close to his wife, close enough that she could smell the cedar and cold air smell that had lived in his jackets for as long as she'd known him, and said very quietly, "I need you to stay calm." She turned to look at him. His eyes were on the room. "Damien, whatever happens," he said, "stay calm. Don't touch me. Don't reach for me." The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the temperature. "What are you about to do?" He finally looked at her then. For just a second, less than a second, something crossed his face that wasn't the mask. Something that looked almost like grief. Then it was gone, and Damien Viscari, Chicago's most feared man, was just the mask again, and the mask didn't feel anything. "Something I should have done differently," he said. He stepped away from her. He walked to the center of the room. The conversations around them began to quiet, not because anyone called for attention, but because of the specific gravity that Damien projected when he wanted a room to listen. Something cellular, something that moved through the air before the sound did, making people stop mid-sentence and turn without understanding why. Within 40 seconds, 500 people were watching him. Damien reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He produced a folded envelope. "I have an announcement to make," he said. His voice carried without effort, without a microphone, filling the room from one end to the other. "One I want to make in the presence of everyone who matters to this city and to this family." Serena couldn't move. She stood 10 feet from him, and she couldn't move because some part of her body understood what was happening before her mind caught up. Her hands had gone cold. The champagne flute she was holding, she wasn't sure when she'd taken it, felt like it weighed 40 pounds. "My marriage to Serena Belmont," Damien said, "is ended, effective tonight." The room went completely still. Not theater still. Not polite quiet. Still in the way that rooms go still when something irrevocable has just happened in front of witnesses. Damien crossed the space between them. He held out the envelope. Inside it, Serena would find papers she had never seen before, drawn up by attorneys she had never met, signed by her husband weeks ago in an office she had never entered. All she had to do was add her signature. She looked at the envelope. She looked at his face. His expression was stone. Controlled, deliberate, devoid of the thing that had crossed it seconds ago. If the grief had been there, if she hadn't imagined it, it was gone now, buried so deep that no excavation she could manage in the next 30 seconds would reach it. "Serena," he said, and his voice was as quiet and as even as if he were asking her to pass the salt. Her hands were shaking. She didn't want them to. She willed them to stop, and they didn't, because a body being betrayed in front of 500 people doesn't respond to willpower the way it should. She took the envelope. She didn't open it. Her eyes stayed on his face, looking for something, looking for the seam in the mask, the fracture, the place where Damien Viscari ended and the man she had married began. She didn't find it. A pen appeared. Aldo Ferrante materialized at her elbow with a pen, which told her something important about how much of this had been arranged without her. And Serena looked down at the paper in her hands, and her handwriting, when she signed, was completely steady. She had always been better at composure than she got credit for. It had simply never cost her this much before. She handed the paper back to Damien. She did not touch him. She turned around and she walked to the exit, and she kept walking, and the crowd parted for her in the particular way that crowds part for women who are refusing, with everything they have, to fall apart in public. No one followed her. Outside, the December night had turned brutal. The wind off the lake had teeth in it, cutting through the elegant fabric of her gown like the fabric was nothing. Snow had begun to fall sometime in the last hour. Not the gentle kind, not the postcard kind, but the kind that came in sideways and stole visibility in under 3 minutes. The valet stand was empty. She hadn't called for a car. She hadn't thought past the door. She stood on the stone steps of the Mortimer estate with divorce papers in her hand and a Chicago winter coming at her full force, and tried to remember how to breathe like a person who was still intact. Her phone was in her evening bag. She had 14 contacts in that phone who had known both her and Damien, and she understood, standing in the snow, that every single one of those 14 people would be watching how she handled tonight before they decided which side of the divide they landed on. That was how his world worked. She had always known that. She had simply never been on the losing side of it until now. She walked. She didn't call anyone. She walked down the long estate driveway in her gown and her heels, and the snow accumulated on her bare shoulders, and at some point the heels became impossible and she took them off, and she kept walking in her bare feet on the salted pavement, and the cold was something extraordinary, not unpleasant yet. Adrenaline does that, insulates you from sensation until the adrenaline burns out, and she walked until the gates were behind her and the street in front of her was just a Chicago street, ordinary, indifferent, blue-lit by the snow glow. She stopped. She was going to be sick. She made it to a planter box at the edge of the sidewalk before her stomach rebelled, and she stood there for a while, hands braced on cold stone, and the heaving was quiet and undignified and entirely real. And when it was done, she was just cold and gutted and alone on a street that didn't know her name. The black SUVs were there when she looked up. Two of them, parked at angles across the street, engines running, lights off. Dark windows. She couldn't see who was inside. They weren't moving. They were just watching. And the specific patient quality of their stillness was something she recognized. That was surveillance stillness. That was the stillness of people who had been watching for a while and intended to keep watching. She straightened up. She walked. She made it 4 more blocks before her legs stopped working. It happened fast. Not a dramatic collapse, not a movie fall, just a sudden loss of reliable function in her knees that put her on the sidewalk before she had time to process it. She sat on the cold concrete in her ruined gown and her bare feet and looked at the sky, which was the particular orange-gray of a city snowstorm at midnight. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that something was wrong. Not just the emotional wreckage kind of wrong, something physical. The dizziness had started inside. She'd attributed it to shock, to the champagne she'd barely drunk, to the specific gravitational disturbance of having your marriage ended publicly in front of Chicago's underworld. But this was different. Her hands were shaking, but not from cold. Her vision had developed a shimmering, unreliable quality at the edges. A passing cab stopped. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s who would have preferred not to be involved in whatever was happening, but had a conscience that wouldn't let him keep driving, opened his door and said, "You need a hospital, lady?" "No," she said. "You sure? Because you look like—" "A clinic," she said. "Something open." He took her to a 24-hour urgent care on Michigan Avenue that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, where a nurse named Patricia put her in a curtained bay and took her vitals and asked all the standard questions with the brisk efficiency of someone working her 3rd consecutive overnight shift. Serena answered everything. At some point, Patricia came back and sat down on the rolling stool across from her, and her expression had shifted, not alarmed, but careful in a way that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. I'm sorry, you said Belmont?" "Yes." "Have you been experiencing any nausea, fatigue, dizziness beyond tonight?" Serena thought about the past 3 weeks, the mornings she'd written off as stress, the smells that had bothered her when they never had before, the exhaustion that had settled into her bones at 7 in the evening and refused to lift. "Yes," she said slowly. Patricia looked at her with the specific gentleness of someone about to deliver news that will restructure everything. "Miss Belmont," she said, "your blood work and the test we ran. You're pregnant, about 8 weeks." The clinic bay was very quiet. Outside, through the partition, she could hear someone's TV playing a late-night talk show, the flat artificial laughter of a studio audience. She could hear the ventilation system. She could hear her own heartbeat, which had gone strange and loud. 8 weeks. 8 weeks meant she had been pregnant before tonight. 8 weeks meant she had been pregnant before the divorce papers, before the ballroom, before Damien's stone face, and Aldo Ferrante's pen and the snow that had swallowed her gown. 8 weeks meant the night he had stood in front of 500 witnesses and ended their marriage. His child had already been growing inside her, and he hadn't known, and she hadn't known. And now she was alone in a clinic on Michigan Avenue at 1:30 in the morning, with this knowledge sitting in her hands like something that could detonate. She thought very clearly, very precisely, about what this information meant. It meant the child she was carrying was heir to the Vescari bloodline. It meant that if anyone in that world found out, Aldo Ferrante, Marcus Benedetti, Giancarlo Voss, or any of the dozen other forces orbiting that empire, This baby would instantly become the most valuable and most endangered person in Chicago. It meant that Damien didn't know. It meant she had a decision to make, and she had to make it before morning. She sat in that clinic bay for a very long time. Patricia came back once, quietly, and left a glass of water. The late-night talk show turned into infomercials. At some point, the snow outside the narrow window above the sink changed angle, shifting from sideways to straight down, which meant the wind had died. Serena made her decision. She left the clinic at 2:45 in the morning with a paper bag of prenatal vitamins and a referral for an OB she would never see, and she did not go home. Home was the Vescari townhouse on Dearborn Street, where the staff knew her and where the security cameras fed to monitors that Damien's people watched and logged. Home was a place she no longer had claim to, technically, and more importantly, home was the first place anyone would look for the ex-wife who had just become inconvenient. She took a cab to a hotel she paid for in cash. She kept emergency cash in her evening bag, had always kept it there, a habit from before Damien that she'd never been able to shake, and tonight that habit had become survival. She sat on the bed in room 412 of a mid-tier hotel off Wacker Drive, still in her gown, and she looked at her phone and didn't call anyone. She thought about Damien's voice. Stay calm. Whatever happens, stay calm. He had known. He had known something was coming, and he had warned her in the most limited way possible, in the least informative way possible, in a way that gave her almost nothing to work with. What had he known? What had tonight been designed to accomplish? The why of it was a room she kept walking toward and kept finding the door locked. She thought about the black SUVs. She thought about this way Aldo Ferrante had materialized beside her with a pen, prepared, ready. His presence at her elbow had not been improvised. That had been placement, deliberate, rehearsed. She thought about the look on Giancarlo Voss's face when she and Damien had arrived. The pity, the relief. What did an old man with Voss's history feel relieved about? She didn't have enough pieces. She needed more pieces, and she wasn't going to get them tonight. And staying still was the most dangerous thing she could do. By 4 in the morning, Serena Belmont had booked a bus ticket under a name that was not her own. She had a second ID, had maintained it quietly for 3 years. The kind of private insurance that women in dangerous proximity to powerful men sometimes acquired. And had spent an hour researching towns along the Lake Michigan coast that were large enough to disappear in, but small enough that strangers didn't collect. She chose Hartwell Point, a town of 12,000 on the southwestern shore, 40 miles from the nearest major highway, with a harbor district and a seasonal population that meant a new face in February wouldn't raise flags. She left the hotel at 5:15. She did not look back at Chicago as the bus pulled out. She put her hand flat against her stomach just once, in the dark of the bus, while the city slipped away behind her, and she thought very deliberately about what she was going to do next, and refused, with everything she had, to think about what she had left behind. In the Mortimer Estates private library, at 10 minutes past midnight, Damien Vescari stood alone with a glass of scotch. He wasn't drinking, and the specific quality of quiet that comes after a room full of people has finally absorbed a shock and resumed its noise. Through the heavy oak door, he could hear the party continuing. Muted now, more subdued, stripped of its earlier energy, but continuing. This was the Underworld's way. Events were processed and incorporated with a speed that would have seemed inhuman to outsiders, but was simply the cost of living in proximity to violence. You learned to metabolize disruption quickly, or you didn't survive long enough to learn anything else. He had watched Serena walk out. He had watched her back, her shoulders, the rigid precision of her posture that he knew in a way that went below thought, was the architecture of a person refusing to break. He had watched her take the exit with her chin level and her heels in a perfect line, and he had kept his own face completely still and his hands completely still, and had not moved to follow her or to stop her or to explain, because he couldn't, not here, not tonight. The plan didn't allow for it. Giancarlo Voss entered the library at 12:14, closed the door behind him, and stood with his hands folded in front of him. At 72, Voss had the posture of a much younger man and the eyes of something much older, flat, patient, accustomed to very long-time horizons. "It's done," Voss said. "Yes." "The council is satisfied." A pause. You understand what the next steps require. Damien looked at the glass in his hand. I understand. She has no protection now, officially. Whatever happens to her, nothing is going to happen to her, Damien said. Voss was quiet for a moment. Damien, the terms were clear. You distance yourself completely. Any contact, any surveillance, any... I heard the terms. Another pause. Longer. Colder. The Russian situation is escalating. Dragunov has been making inquiries. If he learns that your attachment to the woman is still active, it's not. The word landed clean and empty, and Voss studied him for a long moment before nodding once, slowly, and leaving the way he'd come. Damien stood alone in the library. He set the scotch down on the edge of the desk. His hands were, for just a moment, not quite steady. A small tremor, brief, quickly controlled. He looked at his hands the way a man looks at machinery that has developed an unexpected defect, with cold, analytical attention, and he held them still until they obeyed. He had done what the council required. He had made the public declaration, created the official separation, built the firewall between Serena and the bloodline that was supposed to make her invisible to the forces converging on the Viscari Empire. He had traded the marriage, had broken something real and expensive and the only thing he had ever built that wasn't constructed from damage, in order to keep her outside the crossfire. The logic was sound. He had gone over it 400 times in the 3 weeks since Voss had delivered the ultimatum. He had paced his office at 3 a.m. He had sat in his car outside their house and watched the light in the upstairs window and recalculated, looking for the alternative he'd missed, the move that protected her without destroying what they were. He had not found one. The council's message had been precise. Serena Belmont, as Damien's wife, was becoming a political problem. Her inability to produce an heir, or so they believed, was destabilizing the succession. More dangerously, Dragunov had begun expressing interest in her as leverage. As long as she wore his name, she wore a target. Remove the name, remove the target, make her ordinary, make her forgettable. It was the most efficient solution. It felt like removing a rib with bare hands. His phone vibrated. His head of security, a laconic Georgian named Torres, who had been with him for 9 years, sent a 3-word text. She's still moving. Damien stared at the message. He had arranged for discreet surveillance on Serena from the moment she'd walked out the door. Not the council's surveillance, not Voss's people, not anyone who reported to anyone but Torres directly. He understood this violated the terms he'd just agreed to. He did not care. The plan could protect her from the political machinery of the council, but Damien's particular skill, refined over 20 years in a world that killed most people before 40, was understanding that plans were the things that failed first when reality showed up. She's still moving. Torres would only send that if something was unusual. If she'd simply flagged a cab, the message would have been different. Location, he typed back. A pause. Then, urgent care. Michigan Avenue. His chest did something it had not done in years, a sharp contraction, the specific physical sensation of fear connecting with something he hadn't intended to still be vulnerable. He stared at the screen. Stay close, he typed. Don't make contact. Just tell me she's all right. He did not get another message for 90 minutes, during which he stood in the library of the Mortimer estate while the party died around him, while staff began the quiet machinery of cleanup, while the black crystal chandeliers dimmed overhead, and he waited. When Torres finally replied, it was a single word. Fine. And then, 60 seconds later, because Torres was not a man who elaborated without reason, she left alone, headed west toward the hotels. Damien exhaled. He left the estate at 2 a.m. and drove himself. He'd sent his driver away hours ago, back into the city, taking the lake road north of the harbor where the snow had left a thin, clean skin over the pavement that his tires cut through without sliding. He drove precisely and not fast, both hands on the wheel, the radio off, the heat running full. Chicago went by in its winter quiet, the streetlights creating yellow halos in the precipitation, the roads mostly empty at this hour of deep December. He drove to his office, not the legitimate real estate office on Walker, but the other one, the floor he occupied alone in a building he owned outright in the South Loop, and he sat at his desk for a long time with his laptop open and the specific intelligence files that had been arriving for the past month spread across the screen. Viktor Dragunov, 51 years old, born in Yekaterinburg, operating now out of 3 cities simultaneously: Chicago, Miami, and a rotating hub in Eastern Europe that changed location every 60 days. Dragunov ran the American-Russian syndicate with a precision that the American organizations had historically underestimated, a mistake that had proven costly to at least 4 families in the past 18 months. He was not crude. He was patient in the way of a man who had learned patience from people who measured time in decades rather than quarters. And he had, in the past 3 weeks, made 3 separate inquiries through channels that no civilian would ever hear about. Inquiries about Serena Belmont's schedule, her security, her vulnerabilities. Before tonight, those inquiries could have been about leverage against Damien. After tonight, if the performance had worked, if the information had circulated the way Voss intended it to, Serena was nothing. She was a discarded wife, severed from the bloodline, no political utility to anyone. That was the theory. Damien had spent 11 years in this world, and the one thing those 11 years had taught him beyond everything else was that theories about human behavior in environments defined by violence and money failed with extraordinary regularity. He pulled up Dragunov's known associates. He began building the map, connections, timelines, the pattern of resource deployment that would tell him not where Dragunov was, but where Dragunov was going. He worked until 5 in the morning. He did not find what he was looking for, which was reassurance. What he found instead, buried in a communication thread that his people had intercepted 6 days ago, and he was only now examining with the right context, was a name. A name attached to a surveillance request, a name paired with a physical description: dark hair, brown skin, approximately 5'4", last seen at the Vescari townhouse on Dearborn, and a note about biological value. Biological value. He read it twice. He sat very still. Then he called Torres, even though it was 5 in the morning, and Torres answered on the second ring because Torres had never, in 9 years, failed to answer. "Where is she now?" Damien asked. "Last we had her, she was at the hotel off Wacker, but—" A pause. The quality of that pause was wrong. "She checked out, around 5. We picked up her exit on the traffic cam. She got into something. We lost her east of the terminal." Damien's voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. "You lost her?" "Yeah. Find her." He ended the call. He sat in his office as the first gray light of a Chicago December morning began to gray the windows. And for the first time in a very long time, Damien Vescari felt the specific, nauseating sensation of a situation departing from his control with a speed he had not anticipated. Somewhere in the city, or maybe already beyond it, Serena was gone. He had the divorce papers in his desk drawer. He had Torres running dead-end searches on traffic cameras. He had Dragunov's intercepted message with the words biological value burning behind his eyes. What he did not have was the thing he needed most. He did not know what Serena had learned in that clinic at 2 in the morning. He did not know that the equation, the one he had spent 3 weeks building, the one that was supposed to keep her safe by making her ordinary and forgettable, had already collapsed. That the universe had introduced a variable none of his calculations had anticipated. That the woman he had publicly abandoned was already carrying the one thing that made her the most valuable and the most hunted person in the entire architecture of his world. He did not know any of that. He only knew she was gone. And that in 24 years of navigating a world made entirely of dangerous things, losing Serena Belmont was the first loss that made him feel like something essential had been removed from the air itself. Something that the lungs required. Something without which breathing was technically possible, but permanently wrong. He put his hands flat on the desk. He began to search. 3 months later, the first assassins found her. Hartwell Point in March was the kind of town that looked like it had stopped caring about itself sometime around 1987 and had simply never gotten around to resuming. The harbor district smelled of diesel and rotting pierwood. The storefronts along the main drag cycled between open and shuttered on a schedule that seemed to depend entirely on the owner's mood. The lake was gray and enormous and indifferent, and the wind that came off it at 6 in the morning had the particular brutality of a cold that had no destination, that was simply moving because movement was its nature. Serena had been here for 11 weeks. She was living under the name Claire Morrow, renting a room above a hardware store owned by an elderly man named Gus Petrakis, who asked no questions because he had reached an age where other people's problems genuinely no longer interested him. She paid in cash, first and last months up front. She kept the room clean and her hours unremarkable, and her face out of the places where faces got remembered. She had found work at a small harborside diner called the Anchor, doing breakfast and lunch service 4 days a week. The owner, a 40-something woman named Deb Callis, with forearms like a laborer and a laugh that arrived without warning, had hired her without running a background check because Serena had shown up on a Tuesday morning when Deb was short 2 staff members and drowning in a boat crew's order for 16 breakfast plates. "Can you carry 4 at once?" Deb had asked. "Yes," Serena had said, which was a lie she made true within 40 minutes. She had been Claire Morrow for 11 weeks, and in that time she had reconstructed a version of a life that was small and quiet and functional. She woke at 5. She walked the harbor road before the town came alive. She worked the breakfast shift. She came home. She ate. She slept 8 hours because the baby required it, and she had decided that the baby's requirements were the organizing principle around which everything else would be arranged. She was 5 months pregnant. She was not thinking about Damien. This was not true. But she had decided to treat it as true because the alternative, genuinely processing what Damien Viscari's face had looked like in the seconds before he had destroyed their marriage, was a room she could not afford to enter while also maintaining the daily functioning that kept her and her child alive. She kept the prenatal appointments at a clinic in a town 20 miles north, where she was just another name on a waiting list. She had bought used maternity clothing at the Hartwell Point thrift shop. Practical things, dark colors, nothing that drew the eye. She had memorized 3 exit routes from her room, 2 from the diner, and the location of the nearest state police barracks, which was 17 miles east and therefore theoretically useless in an emergency, but psychologically necessary to know. She was managing. On the morning of March 14th, she was carrying plates to table 6, a family of 4, tourists from Ohio, the children bouncing with the uncontainable energy of kids who'd been in a car for 3 hours, when the bell above the diner door rang and a man walked in that she had never seen before. She would not have flagged him except for the shoes. He was dressed like a local, waterproof jacket, jeans, work boots, but the shoes were wrong. They were clean in a way that nothing stayed clean in a harbor town in March. Custom soled. The kind of thing worn by a man whose usual wardrobe cost several $1,000s a day and who had dressed down for an occasion without fully understanding what dressing down required. She set the plates. She did not look at him directly again. She went to the counter and poured coffee with the efficient, unhurried movement of someone who was not paying particular attention to anything, and she said quietly to Deb, who was plating an omelet 12 inches to her right, "Side door. Where does it go?" Deb looked up. She was a perceptive woman. Perceptive in the way of people who'd managed staff in a small business for 15 years and learned to read the texture of a room. She looked at Serena. She looked at the man at the window table. She looked at Serena again. "Allie," Deb said. "Allie runs to the parking lot behind the chandlery. Gates unlocked." "I need 5 minutes." "Take 10, Deb said, and moved to intercept the man's table herself. Serena went through the side door with her coat and her bag and walked down the alley at a pace that was not running, but was the fastest thing this side of running, and she turned left at the gate and came out behind the chandlery and kept moving north along the harbor road, and she was thinking very clearly, with a precision that she recognized as the specific mental state that fear produced when you had no option but to use it as fuel. She needed to know if it was one man or more. She needed to know if they had a room flagged or just her face. She needed to know if this was the council, which would mean one set of dangers, or Dragunov, which would mean something considerably worse. She ducked into the narrow gap between the chandlery and the bait shop next door and waited, watching the alley mouth. A second man came through the side door of the diner 90 seconds later. He was bigger than the first, broader through the chest, moving with the impatient efficiency of someone who expected quarry to behave in predictable ways. He was on a phone. He scanned the alley, looked left, looked right. He had close-cut dark hair and the kind of jaw that suggested Eastern European genetics, and his jacket was better than the first man's, and something about the way he moved, the weight distribution, the speed with which he covered ground, made it clear that he was not here to talk. Dragunov. The word arrived in her mind with terrible certainty. She had known this was coming. She had known from the night in the clinic that the question was not whether she would be found, but when. She had bought herself 11 weeks, which was either excellent or not nearly enough, depending entirely on what happened in the next 5 minutes. She moved in the opposite direction. Behind the bait shop, there was a strip of waterfront access, a narrow path between the building and the seawall. And she took it, moving quickly, one hand pressed against the cold stone of the bait shop wall for balance, because the path was slick with spray, and she was 5 months pregnant and a fall was categorically not an option. She emerged at the north end of the harbor, near the commercial fishing slips, where 3 boats were running engines in preparation for a morning departure, and the noise was loud enough to cover most things. Her phone was in her coat pocket. She had one number in it that she had told herself every single day for 11 weeks that she would not call. She stood between the fishing slips and the seawall with the lake wind hitting her full in the face and the 2 Russian operatives working the harbor behind her and her unborn son doing the thing he had started doing last week. Small, precise movements, not kicks yet, more like the determined repositioning of a person getting comfortable in a space they intended to occupy. And she looked at the phone in her hand. She called Torres. He answered on the first ring. "I need him," she said. No preamble, no identification. If Torres was still running Damien's security, he knew her voice. A pause, 3 seconds, maybe 4. And then Torres said, "Where?" "Hartwell Point, the harbor. I've got at least 2, maybe more, and they're moving fast." "How long can you stay ahead?" She looked at the boats. The largest was a commercial trawler, 60 feet, running engine, captain visible in the wheelhouse. "Maybe 20 minutes if I stay in crowds." 15, Torres said. "Can you get to somewhere elevated with a visual on the main approach road?" "Yes." "Do that. Don't engage. Don't run. Walking pace, running flags, motion detectors if they've got support surveillance." Torres. "Yeah." "Is he coming himself?" Another pause, longer. "He's been looking for you for 11 weeks, Torres said. "What do you think?" She ended the call. She put the phone back in her pocket and took 3 slow breaths and walked, at a pace that was entirely unremarkable, toward the lighthouse access stairs at the north end of the harbor promontory. Well, the SUV convoy came in from the South Road at 43 minutes after her call. She watched from the lighthouse platform, not the top, the midway observation deck, which gave her sight lines without exposure, as 3 black vehicles moved through the harbor district with the particular speed of people who had been given a location and were arriving with intent. They came in clean, no sirens, no theater, just fast and direct. The first SUV stopped at the diner. 2 men got out, not Torres's people, the other kind, the kind who had been in the alley. Then the second SUV came around the south end of the harbor road and intercepted them. What happened next was brief and extremely violent, and over in approximately 90 seconds. And Serena watched it from the lighthouse deck with her hands gripped around the iron railing and her face completely still, and something cold and flat sitting behind her sternum that she recognized as the particular emotional state of a person watching a world they had escaped come back to collect them. The third SUV pulled up to the lighthouse access and Torres got out. He was a compact, dark-haired man in his mid-40s who moved like a closed door. Dense, impenetrable, no wasted motion. He looked up at the observation deck, located her, and said nothing. He just held the door. She came down. He handed her into the SUV without commentary, which was Torres's natural mode, and the vehicle moved before she'd fully settled into the seat, pulling south with quiet precision. Damien was in the back. She had prepared for this. She had spent the last 40 minutes, in the intervals between fear and calculation, constructing the version of herself that could sit across from Damien Vescari without the 11 weeks in the clinic and the weight of everything dissolving her composure entirely. The construction held for approximately 4 seconds after she saw his face. He looked terrible, not physically. He was the same architecture she had always known, the same carved jaw and pale gray eyes and posture that refused casualness. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, or that had been there and she'd never been allowed to see it. Something worn. Something that had been running on a deficit for a long time and was no longer able to fully conceal the debt. He looked at her stomach. The silence lasted long enough to be its own conversation. 11 weeks, he said finally. His voice was very even. "Yes. You knew that night." "Yes." He looked away from her, out the window, at the harbor slipping past. His jaw was tight. His hands, she noticed, were on his knees, perfectly still. The specific stillness of a man applying considerable force to the task of not moving. "You should have called me," he said. The thing behind her sternum shifted, the cold, flat thing, and became something with considerably more temperature and considerably sharper edges. "You divorced me in front of 500 people," she said. "You handed me papers. You didn't even look at me." "I looked at you. For 1 second, before you put the mask back on." "Serena, no." Her voice was quiet, not raised. Quiet in the way that things go quiet when they've passed the point of needing volume to carry weight. "You don't get to say my name like that and then explain to me why I should have trusted you. You had 3 weeks, Damien. 3 weeks where you knew something was coming and you chose to tell me nothing. You could have said anything. You could have said, be ready to run. You could have said, this is going to hurt, but it's not real. You said nothing. And then you humiliated me in front of your entire world and sent me out into a snowstorm without a car and without information and without—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling of the SUV and took one breath, controlled, and brought herself back. "I'm not doing this here," she said. "Where are we doing it?" "Somewhere that isn't moving, somewhere I can leave if I need to." He nodded. One short movement. He picked up his phone and told Torres something she couldn't hear, and the convoy changed direction, heading west now, away from the lake. "Who were they?" she asked after a moment. "Dragunovs, second-tier operatives, the kind he sends for information gathering, not termination. They were here to confirm your location, not to move on you yet." "Yet." "He knows you're carrying my son." The sentence sat between them with a weight that was almost physical. "How?" she asked. "The clinic. Chicago. Someone on the overnight staff sold information. We don't know to whom, but the chain leads back to Dragunov's network. He bought it within 48 hours of your visit." 48 hours. She had been running from something that was already behind her before she'd even gotten on the bus. "Why does he care?" she said, though she already knew. She needed to hear Damien say it. Because a Viscari heir gives him leverage over the bloodline, over the council, over the succession. A child changes the mathematics of every power negotiation in the next 20 years. He paused. He's not the only one who knows. She looked at him. "Voss," Damien said, "we believe the council learned approximately 3 weeks ago. They've been managing their response." "Managing how?" "I don't know yet. The admission seemed to cost him something. That's the problem." She absorbed this. The SUV was moving through flat march countryside now, the lake invisible behind them, the road straight and gray. Torres was in the front, utterly silent, existing in the particular professional way of a man paid to be present and invisible simultaneously. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Safe house, mountain property, 90 miles northwest. It's not on any record connected to my name. It's fortified. I've had 6 people there for 2 weeks." 2 weeks? She turned to look at him directly. "You've been preparing this for 2 weeks, and you didn't—" "I didn't know where you were," he said, "until you called Torres." The stillness that followed this had different quality than the earlier silences. It was the stillness of 2 people processing the specific irony of a situation in which everything had gone wrong in ways that were individually understandable and collectively catastrophic. "I almost didn't call," she said. "I know. If there had been more time, you wouldn't have. I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something she needed to ask him, and she had been not asking it for 11 weeks with the determined efficiency of a person who understands that some questions are doors, and some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. "Why?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. "The real reason," she said, "not the official version, not the version Voss authorized. Why?" Outside, the flat countryside was giving way to low hills, the road beginning to curve. The sky had that particular March weight to it, low and dense, the kind of sky that suggested snow before nightfall. Damien looked at his hands. "The council gave me a choice," he said. 6 weeks before the night of the Mortimer party. They presented 2 options. Option 1, you stay as my wife, You're formally integrated into the bloodline succession structure, which means council oversight, council access, council protection, which means you become a political instrument for the rest of your life, accessible to anyone with enough influence over me. Option 2. Public dissolution of the marriage. You become private, ordinary, unreachable. He stopped. And you chose option 2 without telling me, she said. Yes. Without asking me. Yes. Because you decided for me. He said nothing. You decided, she said, her voice still quiet, still controlled, that I didn't get to choose between those things. You made that calculation by yourself, and you executed it, and you... She stopped again, breathed. Damien, I am not a problem you get to solve by yourself. I'm a person. I was your wife, and you... I know. His voice came out rougher than usual, fractured at the edge in a way she hadn't heard before. I know what I did. Do you? I've had 11 weeks to understand it. That's not... She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. That's not the same thing as understanding it. Knowing you did something wrong isn't the same as understanding why you thought you had the right. He looked at her then, and the thing she saw in his face, the thing that appeared in the brief, unguarded second before he could reassemble the control, was something she had seen only twice in 5 years of marriage. Something raw and structural, damage that went down to the foundation. Something that had been there long before she had known him. He looked away. We're 20 minutes out, he said. She turned and looked at the road ahead. The safe house, when they reached it, was a converted hunting lodge set back 200 meters from a gravel access road in a fold of the low mountains, surrounded by pine on 3 sides, and an open approach from the south that gave anyone inside a clear view of anyone arriving. It was not beautiful. It was built to the specifications of defensibility rather than comfort. Reinforced windows, heavy doors, generator housed in a separate structure. The 6 people Torres had mentioned were visible as they pulled in, 2 at the perimeter, 1 on the roof access, 2 more inside the main door, and a 6th whose position Serena couldn't immediately locate, which meant the 6th was intentionally hidden, which was the point. She got out of the SUV. The March mountain air hit her differently than the harbor air, colder, thinner, carrying pine resin and the particular clarity of elevation. She stood for a moment in the gravel drive and looked at the structure and looked at the mountains behind it and let herself feel, briefly, the specific quality of being trapped between dangers that were arriving from multiple directions simultaneously. Then she went inside. The lodge had been converted with efficiency rather than warmth. Cots, a functional kitchen, monitoring equipment along one wall where 2 people were tracking feeds from what appeared to be a dozen external cameras. There were weapons she didn't examine closely. There was food. There was heat. There was on the kitchen table a folder. She looked at it. Then she looked at Damien. What's in it? She asked. Intercepted communication, Dragunov's network, this week. She opened the folder. She read for 4 minutes, standing at the kitchen table in her Harbortown coat with the mountain cold still on her skin. When she finished, she set the folder back down and stood very still. This isn't just Dragunov, she said. No. These names. She touched the top page. 2 names, circled, connected by a handwritten line to a name she recognized. Recognized because she had sat across from him at a dinner table 4 times and shaken his hand at the Mortimer estate and watched him hand her a pen in the worst moment of her life. This is Ferrante. Yes. Aldo Ferrante is communicating with Dragunov. For approximately 18 months, she looked up. The council isn't protecting you. They're positioned on both sides of the game, Damien said. Yes. The divorce wasn't just to protect you from Dragunov. Someone in the council wanted you gone because they're working with him. The political instrument argument was real, but it was also cover for something else. He moved to the table, stood across from her. Someone set this up, Serena. The succession crisis, the pressure on the marriage, the Dragunov intelligence that's been flowing in both directions. This was designed, and I don't yet know how far back it goes. She looked at him across the table. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pine in the particular sound that high-elevation trees make when the weather is preparing to change, a low-layered rushing, almost like water. You knew some of this when you divorced me, she said. I knew less. But yes, some. And you still chose to handle it alone. He didn't answer. She closed the folder. She was very tired. The kind of tired that went below sleep. The structural tiredness of a person who has been operating on alert for 11 weeks without the option of genuine rest. Her back ached with the particular insistence of a body in the 5th month of pregnancy that had been standing in a cold-moving vehicle for 2 hours. She wanted to sit down. She wanted to sit down and not think about Aldo Ferrante and Viktor Dragunov and the architecture of conspiracy for 10 consecutive minutes. She also knew she wasn't going to get that. "What happens next?" she asked. Damien opened his mouth to answer. Torres appeared in the doorway. His face was the same as always, dense, unreadable. But his body language had changed in the specific way of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. "We have a problem," Torres said. Damien turned. 30 minutes ago," Torres said, "Ricardo Vescari made contact. He's requesting an emergency meeting." A pause. "He says it's about your mother." The silence that followed was of a different order entirely. Damien's face went through something that Serena, in 5 years, had never once seen it do. "My mother," Damien said, and his voice was barely audible, "has been dead for 22 years. Torres said nothing, and in the silence that stretched between those words and whatever came next, Serena watched Damien Viscari's carefully maintained architecture begin to crack from somewhere far deeper than anything she or Dragunov or the council had yet. The lodge went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has just rearranged itself at a fundamental level. Not surface quiet, not the absence of noise, but the specific silence of people recalibrating around a fact that has no clean place to land. Damien stood at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on Torres, and he said nothing for a long moment. The generator hummed in its separate structure outside. One of the monitors along the wall cycled through its camera feeds with quiet mechanical indifference. Serena stood across from him, and she watched the thing that was happening in his face, or rather, the thing that was not happening, the extraordinary effort of a man holding himself completely still over a void that had just opened beneath him. "Say that again," Damien said. "Ricardo Vescari made contact 30 minutes ago," Torres said. "He's requesting a meeting. In person. He says—" Torres paused, and Torres did not pause. Torres was a man who delivered information the way other men drove on a highway, without stopping, without hesitation. The pause was its own communication. "He says your mother is alive, that she wants to see you." The silence that followed was of a different order than the one before it. Damien's jaw moved. Just slightly. A small, involuntary shift. The kind of micro-expression that only appeared when the conscious control had been hit from a direction it wasn't guarding. His hands were still flat on the table. His eyes dropped to the surface of the folder for 1 second, just one, and then came back up. "My mother," he said, "was killed in a car accident on the 14th of February, 22 years ago. I identified her body." Each sentence came out with the deliberate spacing of a man building a wall as fast as he could speak. "I was 14 years old. I stood in a hospital corridor in the middle of the night, and I identified her body, and I watched them close the drawer." Torres said nothing. "So whatever Ricardo is selling," Damien said, and his voice had gone somewhere cold and flat and beyond anger, "I'm not buying it." "He sent proof," Torres said. He crossed to the monitoring station and pulled up a file on the secondary screen. Not the camera feeds, a separate window. A photograph. Digital, high resolution, time-stamped 4 days ago. Damien looked at it. Serena from across the table could not see the image clearly. What she could see was what happened to Damien when he saw it. The specific, uncontrolled response of a body receiving information the mind has no framework to process. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the tension in them releasing involuntarily, and then they came back up harder than before, and his breathing changed, the rhythm of it shifting to something shallower and faster before he regulated it. He looked at the photograph for 9 seconds. "When did he make contact?" Damien said. 34 minutes ago. Encrypted line. He's waiting for a response." "Location?" He offered 3 options, all within 4 hours of here. He says she'll be at whichever one we choose. His way of demonstrating he's not trying to dictate the ground. "It's a trap," Serena said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't intended to say it out loud. It had been a thought, a clear and practical thought, and her mouth had produced it before she'd decided to share it. She didn't apologize for it. "It's a trap," she said again, more deliberately. "Riccardo Viscari is your father's brother. He's been inside the council structure for 30 years. He has every reason to want you destabilized and no history of acting out of loyalty. Whatever that photograph shows, whatever he's claiming, the timing is not coincidental. Dragunov's people were in Hartwell Point this morning. Now Riccardo surfaces with something that hits you at a level nothing else can reach. That is not coincidence. That is sequencing. Damien looked at her for a moment. "She's right," Torres said. "I know she's right," Damien said. "So we don't respond." "We respond." He straightened up from the table. "We choose the location, and we go in with full preparation, and we find out what Riccardo actually knows." He looked at Torres. "And we find out who else he's talking to." Torres nodded and moved to make the call. Serena watched Damien, and Damien was looking at the photograph still on the screen, or he had been, and now he was looking at the wall behind it, at nothing, at the specific middle distance that people look at when they are processing something that has no clean resolution. "How old were you?" she asked. He looked at her. "When she died. When you thought she died. How old?" 14. "And Riccardo was there." "Riccardo delivered the news. He came to the house. He drove me to the hospital." He stopped. Something moved across his face. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something older and more structural. "He held my shoulder when they showed me." The room held that for a moment. "Damien," she said carefully, "don't. I'm not doing anything except, I know what you're doing. I can handle this." "I know you can handle it," she said. "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether you should." He looked at her with the gray eyes that gave nothing away, and she looked back with the brown eyes that had learned, over 5 years, to give nothing away either, and between them was the specific charged territory of two people who had hurt each other badly, and were now, through no design of either one, standing on the same side of something much larger than themselves. "We go tonight," he said. They chose a location 60 miles northwest, a decommissioned railway maintenance building outside a town called Garve, which had a single access road, open ground on 3 sides, and the 4th side backed against a rock face that eliminated one approach vector entirely. Torres went ahead with 2 vehicles and 4 people. Damien went in the 3rd vehicle with Serena and 2 others, and the drive took just under 2 hours through mountain dark, the road empty, the sky having delivered its promised snow. Not heavy, just a thin moving veil of it that the headlights turned to static. Serena had not been consulted about whether she was coming. She had also not been told she wasn't coming, and she had gotten in the vehicle, and no one had said anything, and she had understood this as the closest thing to acknowledgement that the situation was going to offer. She sat in the back beside Damien, and they didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. "Tell me about her," Serena said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "She sang when she cooked," he said finally. "Not real singing, just noise, under her breath. She didn't know she was doing it." Another pause. "She was not a person who belonged in the world my father built. She was too open for it. She felt things in a way that was completely visible. You always knew what she was experiencing because her face couldn't lie." He stopped. "She was the only person in my life whose face couldn't lie." Serena thought about that. "And then she was gone," he said. "And Riccardo stepped in. And Riccardo was nothing like her. Riccardo was the version of the Viscari bloodline that I understood. Calculated, patient, built from damage. He finished raising me." He turned to look out the window. "He was good at it. He was good at turning a 14-year-old boy who felt too much into a man who felt the right amount." The right amount. Serena understood, sitting in the dark of that vehicle, something she had been trying to understand for 5 years. The origin of the mask, the mechanism of it, the reason a man could look at his own wife in the worst moment of her life and hold his face completely still. Riccardo Viscari had built that, had deliberately, patiently, over years of access to a grieving child, built the thing that had been protecting Damien from everyone including himself, including her. She said nothing. The maintenance building appeared in the headlights at 11:40. A low, wide structure of old red brick with a rusted metal roof, two vehicle bays with doors that had been left open. The interior dark except for a single work light on a cord near the back wall. Torres was already there. His vehicle was positioned at the south side with lines of sight on both approach angles, and he stood at the near bay door and said nothing as they pulled in, which meant the perimeter was clean. Ricardo Viscari was inside. He was 64 years old, and he had always been a man who looked like less than he was. Medium height, soft through the middle, with the kind of face that read as amiable until you spent enough time near him to understand that the affability was structural, a load-bearing wall of performance that he maintained with such consistent skill it had simply become his face. He was sitting in a folding chair near the work light, his hands visible, his coat open. The posture of a man demonstrating, deliberately, that he understood the situation and wasn't trying to complicate it. He looked at Damien. "You look like her," he said. "More every year." "I've always thought so." "Don't," Damien said. Ricardo spread his hand slightly. "All right. Where is she?" "Safe. A property in Michigan. It's remote, staffed. She's been there for—" He paused, measuring something. "She's been there for 6 years." The number hit Damien physically. Serena watched it land, the same involuntary half-second release in the shoulders, the same rapid regulation. 6 years, Damien repeated. The full relocation happened earlier, but the Michigan property, 6 years. She's been in Michigan for 6 years. His voice was very flat. "And you've known." "Damien, you've known, and you drove me to the hospital when I was 14 years old, and you held my shoulder." He stopped. The flatness in his voice had developed a fracture. Just one, just hairline, but it was there. "You told me she was gone." Ricardo was quiet for a moment. "Your father staged her death," he said. The work light swayed slightly in a draft from the open bay doors. Outside, the snow continued its thin, indifferent fall. "My father," Damien said. "Marco believed she was going to leave. She had been in contact with people outside, people who were not part of the organization. He found out. He gave me a choice. Take care of the problem, or he would." Ricardo's voice was steady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this for a very long time and had finally arrived at the delivery. "I chose the option that kept her alive. I staged the accident. I relocated her. I maintained the arrangement for 22 years. "You maintained the arrangement," Damien said. "Yes. You maintained it. You chose what to tell me. You chose what to take away from me. You raised me inside a lie that you designed." "I kept her breathing," Ricardo said, and for the first time there was something in his voice that was not steady, something tight and old and defensive. "Your father would have—" "My father is dead," Damien said. "He has been dead for 8 years. She has been in Michigan for 6 years. You maintained the arrangement for 8 years after the man who ordered it stopped existing." Silence. This was the thing that Ricardo could not navigate, the silence that came after that particular sequence of numbers. Not his brother's decision, not his brother's threat, but 8 additional years of choice, 8 years of a man continuing to keep a son from his mother for reasons that were entirely his own. Serena watched Ricardo's face, and in the specific quality of his expression in that silence, not guilt, not shame, but something more calculated than either of those, she understood that Serena's observation in the lodge had been correct and had also been incomplete. This was not just a trap. This was a presentation. Ricardo had delivered this information tonight, in this location, on this timeline, with complete deliberate design. He had chosen the moment. He had chosen the lever. "Why now?" she said. Both men looked at her. "Why tonight?" she said, stepping forward. "You've had this information for 22 years. You've had 8 years of clean opportunity to give it to him. Why now, specifically? Why when Dragunov's people are moving? Why when the council is fracturing?" She looked at Ricardo directly. "What do you need from him that you're buying with this?" Ricardo looked at her with the specific attention of a man revising his estimate of someone upward in real time. "You're smarter than the organization gave you credit for," he said. "Answer the question." He looked back at Damien. "The council is going to move against you. Not eventually, within 72 hours. Voss has been building the structure for months, and Ferrante's alignment with Dragunov completes the capital they need to justify a formal removal. They'll take the empire, and they'll take the succession, and they... He glanced at Serena. They'll remove every complication. Remove, Damien said. Yes. And you're telling me this because I need you mobile. I need you to survive the next 72 hours. Because if the Council and Dragunov complete their consolidation, what I've been building for the past 12 years goes with it, and I have no interest in that outcome. He leaned forward slightly. I am not doing this out of conscience, Damien. I'm doing it because our interests align tonight. I'm aware that is insufficient, but it is what it is. Damien was looking at his uncle with a stillness that was different from the controlled stillness of before. This was the stillness of a man who had arrived at a place past the processing point, past the emotional architecture of it, into something colder and more operational. 12 years, Damien said. You said you've been building something for 12 years. Ricardo hesitated, just slightly. Yes. What? Another hesitation. And in that hesitation, in the 2-second window of Ricardo measuring how much to give, Torres moved. It was fast and it was quiet. Torres's particular gift, and the device he removed from the lining of Ricardo's coat, was small and black and had been active since before they'd entered the building, and Torres held it up so Damien could see it without saying a word. A transmitter. The room changed temperature. Ricardo's eyes moved to the device and then back to Damien's face, and for the first time the amiable architecture of his expression fell entirely away, and what was underneath was not what Serena had expected. It was not guilt. It was not fear exactly. It was the face of a man who had been playing a longer game than any of them, and had simply bet wrong on this particular move. Who's receiving? Damien said. Ricardo said nothing. Who's receiving the signal? Damien said again, and his voice had crossed into somewhere that Serena, in 5 years, had never heard it go. A register below calm, below control, where the temperature was absolute and the only thing moving was the calculation. And then the first explosion hit the north wall. The work light went out. The brick on the north face buckled inward in a spray of dust and fragmenting material, and the sound was enormous and contained simultaneously the specific acoustic quality of a detonation inside an enclosed space. And Serena was moving before she had consciously decided to move. Not toward the exit, which was the instinctive direction, but away from the wall, away from the bay doors which would be covered, toward the interior, toward the structural pillar 3 meters to her left, which was the heaviest fixed mass in her immediate sightline. She hit the pillar and pressed her back against it and put her hands over her stomach, both hands, an instinct so complete it bypassed thought entirely. The bay doors came open. Not the way bay doors open when someone operates them. The other way, the catastrophic way, torn from their runners by the vehicle that came through them at speed, a heavy black truck that stopped 12 feet inside the building and disgorged 4 people before the echoes of the wall detonation had fully died. Torres was already returning fire. The work light was gone, but there was enough ambient light from the vehicle's headlights and the flashes of gunfire to see in terrible broken frames. Torres behind the far support pillar, one of Damien's men down near the chair where Ricardo had been sitting, Ricardo himself invisible, gone, as if the explosion had been timed specifically to provide him a window of exit. Damien was beside her. She didn't know when he'd crossed the space. He was simply there, his body between her and the bay doors, his hand on her arm, not gripping, placed, deliberate, the specific pressure of someone establishing a reference point in chaos rather than controlling a person. Service exit, he said against her ear. 12 meters. Left side. Go. What about... Torres has it. Go. She went. The service exit was a single metal door set into the back wall, and she hit it at speed and it opened, and the cold came in full force, and she was outside in the snow with Damien right behind her, and the sounds of the firefight inside the building coming through the brick in a muffled, horrible frequency. They ran. The rock face was 20 meters behind the building, and they ran toward it because it was the one direction that couldn't be covered from the vehicle approach. And the snow was thin enough that footing was possible, but Serena was 7 months pregnant and running in the mountain dark over uneven ground, and at the 15-meter mark her right foot found a seam in the rock surface that wasn't visible, and she went down hard. Not a fall, not fully. She caught herself on both hands and one knee, and the impact sent a shock through her that made her breath leave her body in a single involuntary sound. Damien had her upright before she'd fully processed hitting the ground. Both hands, not one, and for 1 second, less than a second, his face was 6 inches from hers and it was completely unmasked, stripped of every layer of control by what he had seen in that moment of her going down. And what was in his face was terror. Not the operational calculation of a man managing threats. Raw, undisguised terror for a specific person. It lasted less than a second. Then his hands shifted to support her properly, and he was moving again, and she was moving with him, and they reached the rock face and pressed into the shadow of an outcropping as 2 figures came around the south corner of the building at a run. Damien fired twice. The figures stopped. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds before Torres's voice came over the earpiece. Damien was wearing one she hadn't noticed, and said something that made Damien's jaw tighten in a way she had learned, in 5 years, meant the information was bad. He listened. He looked at her. "The safe house," he said. "They hid it while we were here." She understood immediately. "They split us off. They got Ricardo to pull you out here, and then, our people there are gone." His voice was absolutely flat. "And Ricardo knew the location." He looked at her, and the look was the one she had been most afraid of since the night in Hartwell Point. Not the mask, not the cold operational face, but the one underneath both of those, the one that appeared when Damien Vescari ran out of available moves and had to stand in the space that left. Every piece of intelligence we were working from, the files, the communication intercepts, the structural analysis of Dragunov's network, it was all at the safe house. "It's gone," she said. "Yes." She leaned against the rock face and felt the cold of it through her coat, and breathed and felt her son move inside her, the small, precise movement she had come to recognize as his particular restlessness, the assertion of presence that seemed to intensify when she was still. "Ricardo built the last 12 years around getting you here," she said, "and the council is moving in 72 hours, and Dragunov has your intelligence, and the only person in this situation who knows the full picture from both sides is the man who just walked out of that building." Damien said nothing. "Everything you planned," she said quietly, "is gone. Everything you prepared, the safe house, the files, the operational structure, it's all gone. They designed it to be gone." "Yes." "So what do we have?" He was quiet for a long moment, and the snow continued its thin fall, and somewhere inside the maintenance building Torres was moving through the aftermath, and the mountain dark held everything in its particular indifferent patience. "We have each other," Damien said. And then, because he was Damien Vescari, an honesty of this kind cost him more than other people understood, which I have spent 5 years treating as insufficient. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know you have." The sound of a helicopter reached them then, still distant, still on the wrong side of audible, but moving toward them with the specific determined frequency of a machine that knew. The helicopter came in low over the rock face, and Torres brought it down in the open ground south of the maintenance building with the kind of precision that required either exceptional skill or the specific motivation of a man who understood that imprecision tonight meant death. The rotor wash hit Serena and Damien where they stood against the outcropping, and the snow came sideways and sharp, and she pressed into Damien's side without deciding to, and he put his arm around her without deciding to, and they ran. Inside the helicopter, it was loud and cold, and Torres flew northeast without explaining where he was going, which meant he had already decided and Damien already knew. And Serena sat in the rear seat with her hands flat on her knees and watched the mountain dark rush past below them, and breathed with the deliberate regularity of a person keeping themselves functional by mechanical means. 22 minutes. The helicopter set down in a gravel lot behind a truck depot outside a town called Minter Falls, and a vehicle was waiting, one of Torres's alternates, a gray pickup registered to a shell company that had no connection to any name any of them used. They transferred in under 90 seconds, the helicopter lifting immediately. Torres driving. "Where are we going?" Serena asked. "The only place Ricardo doesn't have coordinates for," Damien said. She waited. "My mother's property," he said, "in Michigan." The silence in the truck was the kind that comes after a sentence like that. The silence of a statement that is simultaneously operational and devastating. The silence of a man using the address of his not-dead mother as a tactical resource because it is the only address in his entire world that Riccardo Viscari, who built his entire world, does not have on file. She didn't say anything. Torres drove. They reached the Michigan property at 4:17 in the morning. It was a farmhouse, not large, not fortified, not anything like the infrastructure of the safe house. A two-story white clapboard structure set back from a dirt road behind a windbreak of old elms, with a barn to the east and flat open land in every direction for half a mile. Light in the ground floor windows. Someone awake. Damien got out of his truck and stood in the frozen dirt of the driveway for a moment. Just a moment. Serena watched from the passenger seat as he stood there in the pre-dawn dark with the cold coming off the fields and his hands at his sides, and she watched him perform, consciously, visibly, and with tremendous effort, the act of deciding to walk forward. He walked forward. The door opened before he reached it. The woman in the doorway was 61 years old. She had gray in her hair that had once been dark, and she was smaller than Serena had imagined, compact, quiet in her frame, with the kind of face that had held a long time without hardening, which was its own particular form of survival. She looked at her son in the doorway, and she made a sound that was not a word, something involuntary and structural, something that came from a place that didn't use language. Damien stopped. He stood there and he looked at his mother, at the face he had not seen in 22 years, at the face he had stood beside a hospital drawer to say goodbye to. And everything he had been keeping still since Torres had said the words in the lodge came apart at once, quietly, without performance, the way things come apart when there is finally nowhere left to keep them. He didn't speak. She crossed to him and put her hand on his face, and he closed his eyes, and Serena looked away. She looked at the flat open fields and the dark sky beginning, at its farthest eastern edge, to consider the possibility of morning. She pressed her hands against her stomach. Her son moved. She thought, we are all going to survive this. It was not a feeling, not an instinct, just a decision, deliberate and structural, made in the frozen dark of a Michigan farmyard by a woman who had learned that some things had to be decided before they could become true. Done. Her name was Elena. She made coffee. She moved through the farmhouse kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been self-sufficient for a very long time and had made a kind of peace with the dimensions of her life. And she spoke to Damien in a voice that was careful and not careful simultaneously, careful with the facts, with the sequence, with the 22 years of explanation that had to be compressed into a pre-dawn hour before the world arrived, uncaring about the emotion of it, about the way her hand shook slightly when she set the cups down. She told him what she knew about Riccardo. She knew considerably more than Damien had expected, which told Serena that Elena Viscari was not simply a woman who had been relocated and isolated. She had spent 22 years paying attention. Riccardo's arrangement with Dragunov goes back 14 years, Elena said. Not 12. He lied to you about that. It started when your father was still alive, which means your father may have known, or Riccardo was already moving against the bloodline while Marco was still running it. She wrapped both hands around her cup. The council fracture is not accidental. Riccardo has been seeding it for 8 years. Ferrante's alignment with Dragunov is Riccardo's structure. He built that relationship. He was positioning for control of the succession, Damien said. He was positioning for control of everything. The Viscari name, the council seat, the alliance with the Russian network. Your divorce was not just the council's decision. Riccardo pushed it. He fed information to Voss about Serena's alleged political liability. He manufactured the pressure. She looked across the table at Serena. I'm sorry, for my part in what that night cost you. Serena met her eyes. You had no part in it. I knew Riccardo's nature and I said nothing, for years, because saying something required surfacing, and surfacing required... She stopped. It required a cost I kept deciding I couldn't pay, until tonight. She looked at her son. He made a mistake, using me as the lever. He thought it would break your concentration. He miscalculated what you'd do with the information. He thought I'd spend time on it, Damien said. Yes. He doesn't understand that the time was already spent. 22 years ago. His voice was entirely even. What do you know about his position right now? Tonight? Elena looked at him for a moment, at the specific quality of her son, at the machinery of the man Ricardo had built from the boy she'd left behind. And something in her expression acknowledged a complexity that had no clean resolution and would not, and then she moved past it. He has a primary operational location, she said. He's had it for 6 years, a converted industrial property outside Garfield, 12 miles from the Illinois border. That's where the council meeting is happening. Voss, Ferrante, the others. They're convening there in... She checked the clock on the wall. 14 hours. Damien looked at Torres. Torres was already on his phone. Damien, Serena said. He looked at her. Whatever you're about to plan, she said, I need you to hear something first. He waited. Ricardo built you, she said. You said it yourself. He took a 14-year-old boy and he built the man you became. He built the mask and the control and the calculation, which means he knows exactly how you think and exactly how you move and exactly what you'll do when you've run out of alternatives. She held his gaze. If you walk into that council meeting the way you've always walked into rooms, alone, with a plan you made by yourself, trusting nothing, he wins. Because that's the man he designed. The kitchen was quiet. Then what do I do? Damien said, and the question came out stripped of every defense, bare in a way that cost him visibly. You do it differently, she said. You do it the way he never prepared for. You walk in with everything visible, and you trust the people beside you, and you let it be messy and uncertain and real. She paused. You do it like a person instead of an operation. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the sky had begun its early concession to morning, a thin gray light arriving at the tree line, tentative, the kind of light that committed to nothing yet. All right, he said. They moved at 2 in the afternoon. Torres had spent the morning building what he could from the resources available. 4 people reached through channels that bypassed every compromised line, equipment acquired from a contact in Detroit who owed favors and didn't ask questions. A vehicle configuration that prioritized speed over armor because armor was heavy and the Garfield property was going to require fast entry and faster exit. Elena had maps, physical maps, hand-drawn over years of information gathering, the kind of documentation that existed only on paper because paper left no signal. She laid them on the kitchen table and walked Damien through the property's layout with the specific, precise recall of a woman who had spent a long time with nothing to do but remember. Serena sat at the table throughout. No one told her to. No one told her not to. At one point, Torres had started to say something. She had seen it in his posture, the slight orientation of his body toward Damien that preceded a private communication. And Damien had looked at him, and Torres had stopped and said nothing, and that was the entirety of the conversation about whether Serena was coming. She was coming, not to the interior. She understood that without being told. But she was not staying in the Michigan farmhouse alone, and Damien understood that, and Torres accepted it, and Elena looked at her with the expression of a woman recognizing something in someone else that she had once recognized in herself. The drive to Garfield took 3 hours and 20 minutes. They came in from the northwest, approaching the industrial property from the direction least likely to be actively covered, a former rail spur that ran along the back fence line, overgrown, the gravel long since reclaimed by freeze-thaw cycles into something between pavement and field. Torres stopped the vehicle 400 meters from the fence. Council vehicles are already there, he said, reading from a text. At least 6. Ricardo's people on the perimeter. We count 4 external, probably more internal. Voss? Damien asked. Confirmed inside. Ferrante. Yes. Damien looked at the property ahead. The industrial outline of it visible above the scrubby tree line, a converted warehouse structure with a newer office addition on the south face, light in the upper windows despite the afternoon hour. He looked at it the way he looked at everything when the decision had already been made, and all that remained was execution. He turned to Serena. Stay at the vehicle, he said. Torres's man Marcus stays with you. If anything comes... I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment. In the flat gray light of the afternoon, he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The exhaustion of a man who had been running a deficit for 22 years and was finally, tonight, going to settle the account one way or another. She put her hand against his jaw. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily since Hartwell Point, He closed his eyes for less than a second, the same involuntary response as his mother's doorway, the same dropping of the last guard, and then opened them. "Come back," she said. He didn't answer. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds, and then he turned, and he and Torres and 2 others moved toward the fence line at a low run. The breach took 4 minutes. Torres had wire cutters and a specific knowledge of industrial fence configurations acquired over 9 years of exactly this kind of work, and the 4 of them were through the perimeter and across the open ground and against the south wall of the warehouse before the nearest external guard had completed his rotation. Damien moved through it differently than he had ever moved through anything. He could feel the difference himself, which was the strangest part. The specific sensation of operating without the architecture Ricardo had built for him, without the sealed compartmentalization, the emotional firewall, the cold calculation that processed situations as systems rather than as things that were happening to people he loved. He was afraid. He was genuinely, physically afraid, and he let it exist rather than processing it into something usable. And it was terrible, and also clarifying in a way he had not expected. They took the east entrance. 2 guards inside. Torres and the man beside him handled it quickly, quietly, the professional brevity of people who understood that noise was the enemy. The council chamber was on the upper level. Damien went up the stairs with Torres at his left, and the knowledge, specific and bone level, that Ricardo Vescari was somewhere in this building. The man who had driven a 14-year-old to a hospital, who had held his shoulder, who had built him piece by deliberate piece into the instrument the situation required. He was not thinking about what he was going to do when he found him. He had made a decision about that and set it aside, and he was not revisiting it. The chamber door was heavy, commercial steel, reinforced, the kind of door that said something about the seriousness of what happened behind it. There was a guard on it who saw Damien coming and made the correct assessment of the situation 2 seconds too late. Torres took him. Damien opened the door. The room inside was large and low-ceilinged. A former supervisory office expanded into something that functioned as a boardroom for people whose board's business would never be filed with any regulatory authority. A long table. 7 men sitting at it, several standing, the specific atmosphere of a meeting interrupted at a critical juncture. Papers out, voices cut off mid-sentence. The collective startlement of powerful people confronted with the particular disruption of having their controlled environment breached. Voss was at the far end of the table. 72 years old, still the straightest posture in the room, his face settling within 3 seconds from surprise into the long, flat patience of a man who had managed crises for decades. He looked at Damien and said nothing. Ferrante was to Voss's right. He had aged since the Mortimer estate, or perhaps he had simply always looked like this, and Damien had been looking at him wrong. His eyes went to the door behind Damien, calculating exits. The specific eye movement of a man whose alliance with Dragunov had just become visible in a room that hadn't known about it. Ricardo was not at the table. Damien scanned the room, fast, complete, the full rotation, and Ricardo was not there. A door at the room's far end closed. He crossed the room in the silence of 7 stunned men and went through it. The room beyond was smaller. A side office, a desk, a window overlooking the northeast approach. Ricardo was at the window, looking out, and he did not turn when Damien came through the door, which meant he had heard the breach and had calculated that running was no longer an option and had decided to face whatever came with the window at his back and his hands visible at his sides. "You went to Elena," Ricardo said, still facing the window. "Yes. Smart." A pause. "I should have anticipated it. I didn't think you'd use the information that quickly. I thought the emotion of it would slow you down." "It did," Damien said, "for about 40 minutes. Ricardo turned. His face had shed the amiable architecture entirely. What was underneath was not monstrous. That was the thing. That was the detail that Damien had been bracing for and now had to process without preparation. What was underneath was tired. Old, tired, and the kind of certain that comes from a man who had made a series of large decisions a long time ago and had been living inside their consequences ever since. "What are you going to do?" Ricardo said. "Finish it." And then it's done." Ricardo looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to dismantle it, aren't you? The whole structure, everything Marco built, everything I maintained. You've already decided." Damien said nothing, which was its own answer. 22 years, Ricardo said. 22 years of... Don't, Damien said. His voice came out the way it had in the maintenance building. Below calm, below temperature, in the register that was not anger, because anger was still a form of feeling, and this was past that. Don't tell me what 22 years cost you. Don't stand in the same room as me and measure your loss against mine. Ricardo was quiet. Where is Dragunov? Damien asked. A pause. The window behind Ricardo showed the northeast approach road, and something was moving on it. Vehicles, headlights, more than two, the kind of convoy that didn't come to talk. He's been listening to this building for 6 hours, Ricardo said. He knows you're here. The convoy was moving fast. How many? Damien said. Enough to finish what the maintenance building didn't. Damien looked at the approaching lights, then back at his uncle. In the main chamber behind him, Torres was already moving. He could hear the specific controlled scramble of it, the barked half-sentences of people repositioning quickly. In the room with him was the man who had built him, who had lied to him for 22 years, who had arranged the humiliation of the woman carrying his son, who had staged the grief that had become the foundational architecture of everything Damien had ever become. And also the man who had kept Elena breathing. He looked at Ricardo. You're going to help me end this, Damien said. Ricardo blinked, just slightly. Why would I? Because Dragunov doesn't keep partners. He keeps instruments. And instruments that have outlived their function don't get retirement. He held his uncle's gaze. You've been useful to him for 14 years. Tonight you became a liability. The moment his people breached this building, you stop being an asset and start being a witness. The convoy was 400 meters out. Ricardo looked at his nephew, and in the calculation visible behind his eyes was the specific arithmetic of a man reaching the end of his options. The same arithmetic Damien had been running for the last 20 hours. The same arithmetic that kept arriving at the same answer. There's a server room in this building, Ricardo said. Sub-basement. 12 years of documentation. Everything I've collected on Dragunov's American network. The Council's offshore arrangements. Ferrante's direct communications. Every transaction. Every order. Every name. He paused. I built it as insurance. Where? Damien said. The first vehicles hit the perimeter fence. The sound of it, metal shearing, gravel thrown by tires, reached them through the window at the same moment Torres's voice came through the earpiece, flat and urgent. Damien, 30 seconds. Where's the server room? Damien said again, and his voice was the voice that closed rooms, that ended conversations, that had been built by a man now standing in front of him, and would, after tonight, be rebuilt by someone else entirely. Ricardo looked at the approaching lights. He looked at his nephew, he told him, and in the sub-basement of an industrial building outside Garfield, Illinois, as Victor Dragunov's vehicles came through the perimeter and his men came through the doors, and the situation contracted to its absolute smallest possible point. The point at which everything that had been built over 22 years of damage and silence and careful, costly control either held or broke. Damien Vescari ran toward the thing that was supposed to save them with the sound of gunfire opening above him and the weight of everything he had left to lose. The sub-basement was 12 steps down a concrete stairwell that smelled of cold and machine oil, and Damien took them fast, one hand on the wall, the gunfire above him arriving through the building's bones as a series of percussive shocks that he felt in his sternum rather than heard. Behind him came Ricardo, moving with the careful speed of a 64-year-old man who understood that the alternative to speed was death. The stairwell door at the bottom was unlocked. Ricardo had a key, which he'd used, which told Damien that whatever his uncle had built down here, he had visited it recently. The server room was small and cold, and humming with the specific frequency of machines that had been running a long time. 2 server towers, a workstation, a UPS battery backup glowing green in the corner. On the desk, a tablet. Ricardo crossed to it immediately. The protocol is already built, Ricardo said, pulling up the interface. I designed it for this contingency. Single authorization. It packages everything and pushes it simultaneously to 6 federal contact points. FBI field offices, the DOJ Organized Crime Division, 2 U.S. attorneys with active jurisdiction. His hands moved across the screen. Every transaction. Every communication, every name attached to every order Dragunov has placed in this country for 14 years. Ferrante's financials, the council's offshore structure, all of it. Do it, Damien said. Ricardo stopped. He looked at the screen. His hands were on the tablet and the authorization prompt was open, and all that remained was the biometric confirmation. His thumbprint, his alone, which was the final architectural choice of a man who had spent 14 years building an insurance policy and had ensured that only he could detonate it. If I push this, Ricardo said, I go with it. Yes. Everything I built, every arrangement, yes. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. I kept her alive, Ricardo said, and it came out quiet and stripped. Not a defense, not a plea, something more like a man placing his one remaining coin on the table and acknowledging that it wasn't enough and placing it anyway. Damien looked at his uncle's profile, the soft face, the tired eyes, the hands that had held a 14-year-old boy's shoulder in a hospital corridor while the lie was already complete and running. He looked at him and felt the full, complicated weight of 22 years and said nothing, because nothing was the honest response. And then he said one thing. She's well, he said. She made coffee this morning. She asked about you before we left, which is more than you deserve and also exactly who she is. He paused. Press it. Ricardo pressed it. The screen ran a progress indicator. Documents compiling, encrypting, transmitting. The quiet digital execution of 14 years of evidence moving through fiber lines toward people whose job was to act on it. It took 47 seconds, the longest 47 seconds of both their lives, in a humming concrete room while the building above them conducted the final business of the Viscari Empire's last night. The confirmation screen read, Transmission complete, 6 out of 6 recipients. Ricardo sat back. Above them, the gunfire had changed rhythm. Less sustained, more intermittent, the acoustic signature of a battle, resolving rather than escalating. Damien took the stairs back up 2 at a time. The main floor of this warehouse was smoke and debris in the aftermath of a fight that had been brief and extremely costly in both directions. Torres was at the east entrance, standing, which was the first thing Damien needed to see, and he read Torres's posture before he'd crossed the full distance. Upright, functional, the specific tiredness of exertion rather than injury. Dragunov? Damien asked. Interior, north side. Martinez has him. Torres's face did the thing it did when the information was expensive. Martinez took 2 in the process. Damien moved north. Martinez was a man named Gabriel Martinez who had been with Torres for 6 years and with Damien for 4. A quiet man from Tucson who spoke rarely and acted with a precision that Damien had relied on without, he understood now, ever adequately acknowledging. He was on the floor of the north corridor with his back against the wall and his hand pressed to his side and his face holding the specific gray-white color of a man managing serious blood loss by willpower alone. Viktor Dragunov was on his knees 6 feet away, zip-tied, with Torres's second man standing over him. Dragunov was 51 years old and had the particular look of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given room, confronting the reality that tonight he was not. His face was controlled, not calm, controlled, the distinction being that calm was a state and control was an effort, and the effort was visible. He looked at Damien with the flat assessment of a professional evaluating a situation that had gone wrong and calculating whether any remaining move existed. There was no remaining move. Damien crouched beside Martinez. How bad? He asked. Martinez considered the question with the honest deliberation of a man who didn't see the point in lying about his own body. Bad enough, he said. Not done yet. No, Damien said. You're not. He looked at Torres, who was already on the phone, already moving the pieces that would get Martinez medical attention before the blood loss made the question academic. Then he stood and looked at Dragunov. Dragunov looked back. The transmission went out 20 minutes ago, Damien said. Federal contacts in 6 offices. Everything your organization has done in this country for 14 years. Every name, every account, every body. He watched Dragunov's face process this. A slow, precise collapse of the infrastructure behind his eyes. The sequential failing of contingencies as each one arrived and was found unusable. It's done. The network is finished. Dragunov was quiet for a moment. You burned yourself with it, he said. His English was precise, barely accented, the English of a man who had learned it as a professional tool. The Viscari name is in those files too. Yes. You destroyed your own empire. Yes. Dragunov looked at him with something that was not quite respect and not quite confusion, but existed in the territory between them. Why? Damien thought about how to answer that. Thought about Serena in the hallway of the Mortimer estate. Thought about a 14-year-old boy in a hospital corridor. Thought about a farmhouse in Michigan with light in the windows, and a woman making coffee who had kept herself alive for 22 years on the slim, specific hope that the cost had been worth paying. He thought about his son, who was not yet born, who would arrive into whatever world Damien built in the next 6 months. Because some things are worth more than what you'd have to become to keep them, he said. It was not a speech. It landed without drama, quiet and final, and Dragunov had no answer for it, which was its own form of resolution. Torres came back. Medical is 12 minutes out for Martinez. Federal response to the transmission is already moving. They had active warrants waiting. We need to be gone in 8. Damien looked at Dragunov one last time. What happened in the next 60 seconds, he did not describe to Serena that night, or any night after. What he told Torres was sufficient, and Torres executed it, and the result was that Viktor Dragunov would not, in the hours and days that followed, be in a position to coordinate any response to the federal actions now in motion. The details existed only in the specific accounting that Damien carried privately, added to the weight he had always carried, adjusted into the new architecture he was beginning, in real time, to construct. He walked out of the building into the night air. Nick. Serena was at the vehicle. She was standing outside it. She had not been able to stay inside it, the confinement of it during the sounds of the firefight having been a particular kind of impossible. And she was standing in the cold with Marcus beside her and her arms crossed over her stomach and her eyes on the building's entrance. She saw him come out. She didn't move immediately. She stood and looked at him crossing the gravel toward her, reading his walk, his posture, the way he held his hands, the specific information that a body communicates before a face does. All the things she had learned to read in 5 years of a marriage that had required her to develop fluency in a language he'd never quite spoken aloud. She read upright, functional, present. She read here. She exhaled. He reached her and stopped, and they stood 3 feet apart in the freezing dark of an industrial lot outside Garfield, Illinois, and the distance between them was everything that had happened and also the decision, present in both of them simultaneously, about what to do with everything that had happened. Martinez? She asked. He'll make it. Torres? Fine. Ricardo? Damien was quiet for a beat. He transmitted the files. He's going to face what comes from that. Another beat. He kept her alive. She nodded. She had already worked out the arithmetic of this, had worked it out standing in the cold during the longest 40 minutes of her life, and had arrived at the same place Damien had. Not forgiveness, not the clean resolution of 5 decades worth of damage, but the acknowledgement that human beings were capable of the worst and the least worst simultaneously, and that sometimes the least worst was the only credit available. What happens now? She asked. Federally, it moves fast. The network is exposed. The council members with direct exposure to the files are going to be managing lawyers and inquiries rather than operations. Dragunov's structure in this country is finished. He looked at her. The Viscari name is in those files. I know. What the organization was, that's over. I know that too. I know that. I'm going to spend the next year in rooms with attorneys and federal agents, and I'm going to dismantle everything that can be dismantled and legitimize everything that can survive the process. It's going to be... He stopped. Ugly and long, and there are going to be people from the old world who don't accept the transition, and I'm going to have to manage that. I know what it's going to be, she said. He looked at her. I know what it's going to be, she said again. And I'm telling you I'm still here. I'm not telling you it's fine. I'm not telling you the last 6 months were acceptable or that the night at the Mortimer estate was something I've processed and closed. I'm telling you I'm still here and that I need you to understand the difference between those two things. I understand the difference, he said. Damien, I understand it, he said, and the way he said it with the specific weight of a man speaking from the part of himself that Ricardo's architecture had never quite reached, the part that had survived everything by going very quiet and very still and waiting, told her that he did. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and that was all, and it was sufficient. Lucien Viscari was born 11 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in April, in a hospital in a city that was not Chicago, in a room that had 2 windows facing east and a view of a river that was running high with the spring thaw. He arrived after 9 hours of labor that Serena managed with the same determined composure she brought to everything, and that cost her considerably more than she showed. He arrived at 6:42 in the morning, when the light was doing what April light does when it comes through east-facing windows over running water, something generous, something that didn't ask anything of you. Damien was in the room. He had been in the room for the full 9 hours, which had required him to be present in a way that the mask did not accommodate, and which he had therefore done without the mask, in the specific exposed and necessary discomfort of a man who was learning, in real time, that presence was not a technique but a choice that had to be remade continuously through discomfort without the protection of control. When Lucien arrived, small, furious, absolute in his aliveness, Damien held him with the careful terror of a man holding something that mattered beyond his capacity to protect it, which was its own form of education. The baby looked at him with the unfocused intensity of the newly born. Damien looked back. He thought, everything I was built to be ends here. Not with Dragunov, not with the transmission, not with the federal agents in their offices processing 14 years of evidence. Here, in this room, with this weight in his hands, he thought, I have to become someone this person can afford to know. He thought nothing else for a very long time because Lucien had a hand the size of a walnut, the hand of something that had no knowledge of the world it had arrived in. And that hand had found Damien's index finger and was holding it with the grip of a person who intended to stay. The months that followed were not clean or simple. The federal process was exactly what Damien had told Serena it would be. Long, ugly, grinding. 3 council members faced indictment. Ferrante was arrested in April at his home on the South Side, photographed in handcuffs by a Tribune journalist whose timing was either extraordinary luck or the result of a tip that Damien would neither confirm nor deny. Voss's legal team managed to keep him from direct criminal exposure. The old man was too careful, had been too careful for too long, but the structure he'd operated within for 40 years was dismantled around him, and he spent his remaining years in the particular purgatory of a powerful man who had survived but had nothing left to be powerful over. Ricardo Viscari cooperated with federal authorities. His cooperation was substantial, and his sentence reflected it. Reduced, but not absent. He served 4 years. Damien did not visit. Elena did, twice, which was her choice, and one she did not explain to her son, and did not need to. The relationship between what Ricardo had done and what Ricardo had preserved would never resolve into a clean accounting, and all 3 of them understood this without requiring it to be spoken. The Viscari business interests, the legitimate ones, the real estate holdings, the logistics contracts, the development portfolio that had always been the clean surface over the other infrastructure, went through 18 months of legal restructuring and emerged on the other side as something that could be described accurately to a regulator or a banker without requiring specific omissions. It was not a transformation that happened without cost. There were people from the old structure who tested the new boundaries and had to be shown, through means that Damien did not discuss publicly, that the boundaries were real. There were mornings when the weight of the transition pressed down on him with the specific gravity of a man carrying a past that was not yet fully past. He carried it. He carried it differently than he had carried things before. Not alone, not in the sealed compartmentalization that Ricardo had built into him, but in the way that people carry things when they have decided to let someone else know the weight exists. Serena knew the weight. She did not take it from him, because that was not what she had offered. She witnessed it, which was the thing he had never had before, and which turned out to be the thing that made the difference. They moved back to Chicago in September. Not the Dearborn townhouse that was sold, cleanly, to a real estate attorney who had no idea what walls had held in that building and didn't need to. They bought a house in Lincoln Square, a large old house with plaster walls and deep-set windows, and a garden that had been neglected for several years and required attention. Serena planted things in it in the fall for the following spring, the particular act of faith that gardening requires, putting things in the ground before the season that will call them up. Lucian, by October, had developed strong opinions about the color of ceiling fixtures and expressed them loudly, which Damien found unreasonably satisfying. Elena came for Thanksgiving. She sat at the table in the house in Lincoln Square and looked around at the walls and the light and the particular quality of noise that a home produces when the people inside it are not afraid of each other, and she was quiet in the way of a woman absorbing something she had been holding the distant hope of for a very long time. After dinner, she held Lucian in the kitchen while Serena made coffee, and Damien stood in the doorway and watched his mother holding his son, the two of them existing in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of each other, and he felt something move through him that he had no precise language for. A releasing of a pressure so long-standing he had stopped being able to identify it as pressure, and had simply called it the structure of himself. He stood in the doorway and let it move through him and did not try to make it into something manageable. Torres came for Christmas. He sat at the table and ate and talked less than anyone else, and was clearly glad to be there. And when he left, he shook Damien's hand at the door and said, quietly, that Martinez had been cleared medically to return to work, and Damien said he'd call him in January. And Torres nodded and walked to his car, and that was the entirety of it, which was the language they both spoke. In February, 14 months after the night at the Mortimer estate, 12 months after Hartwell Point, 8 months after Lucian, Serena was in the kitchen of the Lincoln Square house on a Tuesday evening when Damien came home from a meeting with the attorneys handling the last phase of the restructuring. He was tired in the way he had been tired for a year, the specific attrition of a man doing necessary and unglamorous work, and he came through the door and set his bag down in Lucian. From the living room floor where he had been engaged in the important work of dismantling a wooden block arrangement, made a sound that was almost a word and held his arms up. Damien crossed to him and picked him up, and the tiredness shifted. Not disappeared, shifted. The weight redistributed by the specific ballast of a 10-month-old who had no context for attorneys or restructuring or the long tail of a dismantled empire and didn't need any, who only knew that the person holding him was warm and present, and his. Serena watched this from the kitchen doorway. She was holding a mug of tea, and she was watching her husband hold their son in the living room of a house that was theirs, a house that was simply a house, and she was deciding something. She had been deciding it for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment, which she now understood was not a moment she could engineer. It would arrive or it wouldn't, and what she was experiencing right now, watching Damien's face with Lucian in his arms, watching the unguarded quality of it, the face he wore in this room with this person, had the feel of something that would not be improved by waiting. She put the mug down. She crossed the living room. She took Damien's free hand and placed it flat against her stomach. He looked at her. She looked back. He was still for a moment, very still, the particular quality of a man receiving information and feeling it arrive in a different part of himself than thought. Then something crossed his face that she had first seen in the ballroom of the Mortimer estate, in the single unguarded second before he'd reassembled the mask, the thing she had looked for the seam of and not found. Only now there was no mask to reassemble afterward. It stayed. The grief and the love and the specific terrified joy of a person who had nearly destroyed the thing they most needed and had been given, through some combination of stubbornness and grace and the willingness to stand in the cold and not look away, the impossible chance to do it differently. Again, he said. Twins, she said. The doctor thinks twins. Lucian made another sound that was almost a word and grabbed a fistful of his father's shirt. The house was warm. Outside, Lincoln Square was doing what Chicago does in February, enduring, cold, indifferent to the particular urgency of individual lives. The black crystal chandeliers of the Mortimer estate existed somewhere across the city, throwing their fractured light over whatever gathering was happening tonight, whoever was performing for whoever's benefit. In the house in Lincoln Square, none of that was present. Damien looked at his wife's face, and she looked back at his, and between them was Lucian making his persistent, almost word, and below Serena's hand was the beginning of whatever was coming next. 2 lives, 2 more arrivals into a world that was imperfect and costly and real, into a family that had been built, at considerable expense, From the ruins of the family it had first tried to be. "Okay," Damien said, not eloquent. Not the words of a man who had found the language for everything he'd been through. Just the word of a man who was present, who had chosen presence, who intended to keep choosing it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He held her there and held his son, and stood in the living room of a house that was simply a house, in a life that was finally, imperfectly, and with full knowledge of what it had cost, his own. Outside, the February wind moved through the street. The lights stayed on.